Hey, my name is Pooja and welcome to my new channel. So today I'll be talking about 10 interviews that I had through big tech companies as well as FAANG. One thing I did want to mention was of the 10 interviews, 6 of them were through 2 different companies. So I actually interviewed 3 times with one company and then 3 times with the second company. The first company that I interviewed with, it was about a year ago, and it was at Amazon. And the way that I got that initial interview was actually through a recruiter. So that initial phone screen with HR is pretty standard. I had that with a lot of other companies as well. Typically what they ask you is what you did in your past experiences. They talk through your resume. It's basically like a first impression interview. So for them, they screen candidates based on, do they have the correct leadership skills? Are they able to communicate? Are the experiences that they listed true? And that's exactly what he did for me. So it was, again, pretty standard. I answered his questions. Some example questions could be, tell me about your time at company X. And then I would just respond by giving a little bit more information about the technologies I used, what I'm interested in, what kind of leadership role I took on. It's just an HR phone screen. They're mostly screening to make sure that your resume fits who you are as a person and that you are actually telling the truth about what you've put on your resume. The second round, or I guess first round of interviews, then took place a week later. So for me, I had an initial phone screen, but then I had to take an online assessment. So typically their online assessments, and this is information you can just get online, consist of 2 to 3 questions, and they're coding questions. So it's a very technical process, but you don't have to talk with an interviewer, do any whiteboard coding, anything like that. It's typically done in a simulated IDE. So the code doesn't necessarily compile, but you can type it and have some syntax errors show up if it's not correct based on the language you've chosen. The way that I prepared was using LeetCode as well as AlgoExpert, and those helped tremendously. So I would say that studying easy to medium questions for the first few rounds, but also having a variety of different concepts under your belt should really help. Knowing a breadth of experiences introduces you to a lot of different patterns that you might see in many interviews. So exposing yourself to more patterns versus the depth and difficulty of one pattern will probably help you out in the long run. So I had that initial online assessment, and I'm not gonna lie, at this point, I had not been studying LeetCode or using AlgoExpert or any other platform. I had mostly just been Googling a few things about trees and graphs. I have the Cracking the Code interview book, so I did read a little bit of that, but to be honest, I had little to no preparation. I was just going into it blind. I just wanted to see what would happen. At this point, I was very happy with my job, so I wasn't planning on making a move either. So when I got the questions, I didn't really realize that sometimes they're looking for the most optimal answers. Now, I will say that typically companies don't look for the most optimal answers in that initial phone screen or in that initial online assessment. They're more so looking for optimal answers in the final round interviews. So when I got these questions, they were about medium difficulty. They weren't too hard, but there was probably a better way to solve them than how I solved them. I was very brute forcey in my approach. And it actually ended up still working out for me, so I actually passed that initial online assessment. In this case, I had 1 round of interviews, and then I was sent to a second round of interviews. So that also could have been because I didn't optimize my solution fully. Maybe they wanted an extra round of interviews just to make sure that I was the right candidate for the job. So I passed that initial online assessment, but I was sent to a second round of interviews. So my second round of interviews actually didn't go as well as my first. I'll just put that out there right away. The second round of interviews, it was 1 medium question. It actually wasn't too bad either, but again, at this point, I hadn't even been really studying LeetCode. So the interviewer, it was a he started asking me questions and building on top of some of the answers I provided to then come up with a bigger solution. And that's pretty typical in a lot of interviews where they first ask you a sub-problem and then build on top of that sub-problem to make it a little bit more complicated, just so you have a base to go off of. Now, again, this is me with not having done much research or looking into this process on my own time. So what you're supposed to do, and what I eventually ended up learning the hard way, is you don't need to start solving the problem right away. Actually, you shouldn't start solving the problem right away. You should ask a ton of clarifying questions. So again, this also depends on your time management. If you have to solve 2 questions in 45 minutes, you'll probably want to zero in on conceptually how you want to solve the problem within 10 minutes. But if you have a full 45 minutes to solve one problem, and it's typically a medium problem in the beginning stages, then what you can do is actually take a breath, ask the interviewer questions. You don't need to worry about rushing through the problem. You need to worry more about having those communication skills, asking the right questions, going through the problem at a pace that's comfortable to you, and also minimizing any syntax errors that you can. So in my case, I did rush through the problem. I didn't really ask a lot of clarifying questions. It was a little bit hard to sometimes communicate with my interviewer. I felt that he was getting a little bit frustrated that I wasn't clarifying things, so he would drop hints in order to encourage me to ask questions, which I kind of picked up on, but again, to the untrained eye, this wasn't a process that I was super familiar with, so I kind of just stumbled through it. It's probably a little painful to watch. At the end of the day, I ended up getting a semi-working solution. Again, the code doesn't compile, but it looks like my interviewer wasn't completely convinced that it was correct. So after the interview, I had a feeling that I didn't pass that round, which I was right. I did not pass that round. And at that point, I was like, you know what? It's okay. I tried. I didn't really study, and I got to the second round. That was good enough for me. Fast forward to March of 2021, so this past March, and I got another call from an Amazon recruiter, and they asked me if I'd like to begin the interview process. This time, I was a little bit more excited about it. I had worked at my company for a year, and I thought, you know what, why not? I may as well give it my best shot. So what I ended up doing was I had that initial phone screen with the HR, just like the first round, and we talked through my job, my experiences, which had changed a bit in the past year, and then we proceeded to schedule a time for my online assessment. This time I did start studying LeetCode. It was a little bit more light, but what I ended up doing was first going online to figure out what are the different concepts that I need to know. So within that data structures and algorithms realm, what different data structures exist? How can I utilize them? What are the different algorithms that are used? And how can I use pattern matching to understand when I see a problem, what the best way to solve it is? And the only way to do that, honestly, is to just practice a lot of problems. Now, when I say a lot of problems, I don't mean just randomly selecting a bunch of problems and practicing them. I mean, on LeetCode, there's a way to filter by category. So figure out which categories are your weaknesses. And at that point in time, it had been so long since I'd taken a data structures and algorithms class that I decided to just review everything. So I would say write down all the categories that you want to review and then start doing easy questions on LeetCode within those categories. Once you get comfortable actually practicing and solving those problems, then I would move on to the medium. But I wouldn't move on to medium and hard until you've gotten a breadth of different experiences with those specific concepts. So going back to Amazon, I had my initial online assessment, pretty standard, pretty similar. They had different questions, but the level of difficulty was pretty similar, so easy to medium questions. I passed that round, and then I got to actually the final round. So I went to the final round interview, and believe it or not, I was sick the day of my interview, just like I am now. I feel like it's a trend where I always get sick when I have to do something important. But I was like, you know what, I studied, let's see what happens. I'm not feeling the best, but we'll see how this goes. So it was basically a 4-hour interview. I had 4 rounds, and each round was technical. One round was actually a system design interview, so it depends on what level you're interviewing for. I was, I believe, an STE 2, or like the equivalent of that, like a mid to senior level engineer. So they were looking for someone that had some systems design experience. I didn't have a ton, but I had experienced some of it by working with my coworkers. So the first 3 rounds were technical, and there were 2 medium questions and 1 hard question. The 2 medium questions were fine. It's not something I'd seen before, but it's something that was manageable. The hard question was pretty hard, and to be honest, I hadn't practiced something specific like that either, but I'd seen videos of something similar. So that last round didn't go so well for me, but that's okay. So all in all, the interview went okay. It's not that I think I passed, but I don't think I did terribly. So I eagerly awaited the results, and they kind of had the same impression that I had of my own interviews. They told me that they did like my leadership skills. They weren't quite sure about my technical skills because of the way that I solved some of the problems. They weren't completely optimal. I did study, but I didn't study enough to have gotten the most optimal answer. So what they said was they wanted to refer me to a different role, which was a systems engineer role. So it was a little bit more stemmed in infrastructure versus like more development. But the catch was that I would have to do another final round interview. Now, by final round interview, I mean just like 2 small interviews. I ended up thinking about it and then doing those interviews. However, I ended up failing because the questions that they asked didn't have anything to do with my experience or development or even data structures and algorithms. So it ended up being a little bit more difficult for me to pass those rounds. So the rejection didn't really come as a surprise to me, but to be honest, I feel like once you start on that leak code path, then it just spirals from there. It becomes a very addicting process. And from there, what ended up happening was more and more recruiters were reaching out to me within the summer of 2021. So shortly after, a few weeks later actually, I got a call from Microsoft. And by call, I mean they reached out on LinkedIn. So I chatted with the recruiter, same process as Amazon, had that initial phone screen, it went well. And then he set up a time for me to go through an online assessment. So I went into this assessment not really having studied anything because I was pretty confident that after passing the 2 online assessments through Amazon, without much studying, I was able to pass this one as well. So I took the online assessment and I actually ended up failing it. So that wasn't good for me. I kind of talked to him about it and he mentioned that I can try again in a few months. It was Microsoft policy that you have to wait a few months before trying again, but I was given that opportunity later. So more on that to come. And then about a month later, Reddit reached out to me. So I had a conversation with them. I was living in a different state at the time, so I wasn't really sure what my plans were, and I told them I'll let them know in a few weeks if I was still interested. I knew at that time that if I wanted to get Microsoft and try again or get Reddit, I had to really, pick up my studying and start working on those leak code questions. I ended up actually moving back from Atlanta to Minnesota, and at that point I was ready to interview with Reddit. And I went through that interview process really excited. I had the initial phone screen with HR again, and then I set up a time for my initial interview. So on the day of the initial interview, it was a 45-minute round with just 1 question. I was asked the question and immediately my heart sank. It was not an easy question and I struggled to get through it. It was more on the difficult side. And then I realized that the caliber of interview questions really varies depending on the company that asks you these questions. So Reddit was one of those companies that I think was looking for the perfect answer, the most optimal answer. I did not have that. I don't even think I had a semi-optimal answer. So I did fail that interview. After that, actually, I got reached out to by a recruiter at Google. So I had an initial phone screen with Google. And again, at this point, I was kind of halfway still studying leak code, looking at Algo Expert, things like that, doing my mock interviews with my friend. So I was sufficiently taken care of going through the motions. So again, I got to the Google initial phone screen, very excited. At this point, I had already had the HR phone call, and I was excited to go through this interview process. And I got a question that wasn't too difficult. It was a medium question, I would say. One of the concepts was a little bit more difficult if you hadn't studied it in the past. So the interviewer, she built off of the sub-problem that she gave me initially in order to see if I could optimize the problem or the algorithm that I had written. So for me, I conceptually understood what to do, but I didn't quite know how to translate that into code, which again, that just comes with a lot of practicing of different problems. So I didn't end up getting that one either. I got rejected at the initial phone screen, which was okay. I kind of expected it, but I was hoping that I passed it. I just didn't. But at this point, I was hoping that I would get something. So I reached out again to the recruiter at Microsoft and mentioned to him, hey, in a month, can I still take your online assessment again? And he confirmed that yes, I can. So I at least had something on my schedule to study for. During this process, I also got reached out to by LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is actually a subsidiary of Microsoft. I really wanted to work at Microsoft, but working at LinkedIn, a place that has a similar culture and similar pay, similar benefits, that would have worked really well for me as well. So I started talking to the recruiter, kind of figuring out when's a good time for me to interview. I decided I wasn't quite ready. I wanted to take a break from the interview process. I was also about to travel. So I decided to try to schedule my interview around the same time as Microsoft, which was like a month later, just so I could have enough time to actually start practicing a few hours a day and really getting prepared for that final round interview. So at this point, just to recap, I had had 2 interviews with Amazon. I'd had one with Microsoft, one with Reddit, and one with Google. So 5 interviews, 2 of them so far were with one company, and I ended up failing all of those interviews. But again, at this point, I was getting a little bit more motivated, not a little bit more, a lot more motivated to keep going, especially because the season wasn't over and a lot of recruiters were still reaching out. So I ended up having my Microsoft online assessment first out of the 3 interviews with Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Amazon. So when I went through this online assessment, I actually thought it was a lot easier than the first assessment that I had. So I was really confident going into this. So they actually gave me an hour to finish 3 questions, and I solved all 3 of them in about 30 minutes. But I ended up spending about 20 more minutes just really making sure that I did everything correctly and that the test cases were passing and everything like that. And then I submitted. Again, I was really confident that I would get in. And then I got rejected. So I was a little bit bummed, but per Microsoft policy, he said I could apply again in a few months. And by apply, I mean just take that online assessment again, and he would move me forward. Moving on to LinkedIn, that initial phone screen was basically with an actual interviewer. So this wasn't an online assessment. This was the first initial phone screen other than So Reddit and Google had their initial phone screens with a real human as well as LinkedIn. So I had that phone screen with LinkedIn. There was a interviewer, and then there was also a someone who was shadowing this person. So they asked me 2 questions, and the 2 questions were probably easy to medium, but they wanted me to try to optimize both answers as much as I could. So it was more of a discussion, and I really enjoyed that process because we would kind of bounce ideas back and forth. I felt a lot more comfortable in this IDE environment as well, so I think that went okay. I didn't want to feel overconfident because of how I felt with Microsoft, clearly getting rejected. I ended up passing that initial phone screen and getting to the final round interview. Next, I had my initial phone screen with Amazon again. And this was an online assessment. So I went through that online assessment and it was pretty standard. Again, 2 medium questions. I ended up passing that. So I had 2 final round interviews that I was preparing for at this point. So then I had 2 final round interviews scheduled, one with LinkedIn and then one with Amazon. I was still really hopeful that I could try again for a 3rd time with Microsoft, just because they were the ones that I was hoping to get a job with the most. But then the day came for my Amazon interview and I went through the motions. It was similar to the 2nd time around when I had the final round interview with Amazon a few months prior to that. So there were 4 questions of medium difficulty, I would say. They weren't very difficult. Maybe one of them was, but because I had studied for 2 to 3 hours a day at this point for a month and a half straight, I was a little bit more confident that I could solve it and that I could solve it optimally. So I went through the 1st round, and one thing I did forget to mention is Amazon typically has a bar raiser, and what that is one of the interviewers who is fully removed from the specific team that wants a candidate to join their team comes into this interview process, and they are expected to raise the bar for all of these interviews. So they make sure that you are actually increasing Amazon's standards and that you're better than 50% of the people that already work there. So I'm pretty sure I got my bar raiser as the 1st interviewer, and he was pretty tough. He was intimidating, which Amazon is actually known for. But he was looking to see, were my leadership principles on point? Was I able to answer his behavioral questions? Even though we had 45 minutes this time, the first 10 minutes were spent on behavioral questions, which meant the next 5 to 10 minutes would be me asking clarifying questions of the problem that left me only about 20 to 25 minutes to actually solve the problem. Thankfully, all of the problems that I was asked were some variation of problems that I had done in the past. I say that just watching the videos isn't necessarily enough. You have to practice a ton of problems to actually get into that rhythm of coding really quickly without making that many mistakes. So I ended up getting through that 1st round. I thought I did really well. I got to the 2nd round, and this was a system design interview. That went okay. I don't think I did that well in it, but I also didn't prepare as much for that aspect of the interview. The 3rd round came, and again, it was a medium question. I thought I did really well. It's not something I had seen before, but again, I had practiced so many different patterns and ways of thinking that it came a little bit more quickly to me in order to just solve the problem on the spot. The 4th round interview also went really well for me, and I thought by the end of that entire process that I had definitely gotten a job at Amazon. So my next interview that I had to do was LinkedIn. The day before my final round LinkedIn interview, I got an email from Amazon and I had been rejected. So for me, that was the first time that I actually felt a lot of disappointment, not necessarily because I wanted Amazon, but because I thought I had gotten it. I thought I had done well enough to pass that final round interview, even though I hadn't. So for me, that was a big ego bust because I'd practiced, I'd studied a lot of code, I had watched videos, I'd done a lot of different practice problems, and I felt very confident in my behavioral answers. But the only thing I really could do was move forward. So I went into that LinkedIn final round interview as prepared as I could be, and I think I nailed the first interview. So this one was actually 5 rounds, I believe, with a lunch round. So the first was just a long conversation with the hiring manager. It was more behavioral questions. The second round was coding. I had 2 easy to medium questions that were asked of me, and I think I definitely nailed one of them. The second one I struggled, but I got some answer that wasn't fully optimal. And later I found out I actually did really well in that interview, in that round. And then the next round was a very difficult coding question. Again, I can't say what the question was, but I can talk about kind of the different types of questions I saw within all the different interviews in a later video. So basically, I went into that round. I felt as though I had completely failed it. It was terrible. I don't think I did well in that round. The interviewer was super nice though, and he calmed me down, told me that it's okay. Like, this is a very difficult question, and so let's just kind of collaborate through this and see if you can pick up on some of my signals. So he kind of walked me through the process. Unfortunately, I could not solve the problem. So I had a feeling that because I bombed that coding round that I didn't get the job. There were only 2 coding rounds, 1 system design, 1 lunch interview, and then 1 behavioral. So then the system design interview came around and actually my internet cut out. So I had to do that entire interview over my phone, which wasn't ideal because I had to draw some things for the system design interview. So that was pretty difficult to do using my phone, as well as drawing on a piece of paper. I tried to pick up my phone and like show him on video what I was drawing. It just didn't end up going well. After the LinkedIn interview was completed, I got a email from my recruiter and then set up a time to chat with her. She wasn't able to give me information specific to the interviews, but she kind of told me like, hey, these are some things that you should work on. Obviously that means that I did not pass, but she did say that the team liked me, so they wanted to bring me back for another interview when a new job rec opened up in January. At this point, I only had the potential Microsoft interview going for me. Thankfully, I got a call from another recruiter. This time it was a Facebook/Meta recruiter. So I had an initial phone screen with the HR, and it was a pretty standard process. So for step 1 of the process, the HR phone screen, they gave me a bunch of resources to look at before my phone screen. Once I passed that round, they had more resources for me to study up on my first round interview. The expectation was that I could solve 2 medium to difficult problems within 45 minutes. So that was a really tight time constraint, I will say that. But the practice problems that they gave actually really helped me. So as long as you timed yourself, made sure that you could finish 1 problem in about 15 to 20 minutes, then you were good to go. So eventually the big day came and I had my first round interview with Meta, and it was basically exactly the format that they had said. So the entire round consisted of 2 questions. The first question I was able to finish within 15 minutes because I had seen some variation. And then the second question that I had was also pretty standard. I'd actually seen it on LeetCode before. It was pulled straight from LeetCode, and I was able to solve that as well. So it wasn't much of a surprise when they said that I've gone on to the next interview. Of course, the standards were also probably a little bit lower for that initial phone screen. So that's why I was pretty confident that I had gone on to that next round. So meanwhile, I reached out to my recruiter at Microsoft again and asked him like, hey, it's been a few months, can I go ahead and get started on that initial online assessment again? And so he gave me the thumbs up and I went ahead and took that online assessment. So then the recruiter got back to me, he was super excited, he said that I passed that initial online assessment and that an interview date had been booked for me. So now I had 2 final round interview dates, 1 with Meta and 1 with Microsoft. Once my travels were over and I was back home in Minnesota, I ended up going through my final round at Facebook. And again, my practice was mainly the same as what I had been doing before, which was LeetCode, the practice problems that Facebook had given me, as well as the algo expert problems that I was doing online. I ended up having 4 rounds. 2 of them were technical rounds, so more so data structures and algorithms. They had similar time constraints, so basically I had 45 minutes to answer a few behavioral questions and then get through 2 problems. The 3rd round was a behavioral round, so it was all behavioral questions. They asked me things such as, how do I deal with conflict? What have I done in the past that will help me in my experience moving forward at Facebook? What kind of projects have I worked on? What kind of leadership roles have I taken on? Things like that. My last round was a design round. So I had someone who kind of judge me on the design process, and I had to draw certain things on a whiteboard, talk through each of the processes, each of the layers. As it was mostly like an infrastructure interview, so I did okay. I'm not like super strong on infrastructure right now, being only 3 years in the industry, but I did know a few things, and I did some research ahead of time to kind of get through this round. So the first round, the coding round, I thought I did amazing, and I was very surprised that I actually did that well. And I could tell that I was getting signals from the interviewer that he was pretty pleased with my performance as well. But the second technical round was a different story. So he asked me a question that I had actually seen online on LeetCode before. And it was also a question that me and my friend who used to study together had discussed. Unfortunately, I couldn't remember exactly how to solve it, and it didn't quite fit any of the patterns that I was used to either. That, along with me being a little bit nervous, kind of messed that up for me. So I couldn't really get through that initial problem. I stumbled through it. I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't gonna pass this entire interview process because of that one question. So then I went into my second question within that round, and that one was pretty easy, but he was pushing for me to optimize on my solution, and I couldn't quite optimize it in time. Conceptually, I got something out, but I wasn't able to implement it. The behavioral round was pretty easy. All the behavioral rounds are very standard. They ask you things about leadership, about your past experiences, and you just kind of have to vibe with the interviewer at that point. And then my last round was that system design, and again, I thought I did okay, not that great in that one. So at the end of the day, I got my results. They typically take 14 days to actually get you your result. I got mine back within 2 or 3 days, which actually is a bad thing. That means that they're 100% sure that you won't get to the hiring committee. So if they get back to you pretty soon, it's typically a rejection. But she did say that I could apply again in the future, you know, so keeping that door open in case I wanted to continue looking for new opportunities at Facebook. So then the day came for my final round interview at Microsoft. So I felt pretty prepared. I did a few more difficult questions on AlgoExpert beforehand, just because I had heard online that there were some types of data structures that were unique to Microsoft's process that I should probably brush up on. So I did that. The first round, so I had 4 rounds basically. The first round was a technical round. All 4 rounds were pretty much technical. One of them was kind of a design round, but it was more so centered around like object orientation than it really was for system design. So that first round was basically 1 question, but once I solved that 1 question, the interviewer asked me to basically solve on top of that by optimizing. And I thought I did pretty well in that round. I felt really confident, and I also, again, got signals from the interviewer that I had done well. In the second round, I was asked a object orientation problem. So that was more design. This type of interview is a little bit more ambiguous, so either you really like it because you can go a lot of different ways through this interview and there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, or you might not like it because, again, it's very ambiguous. There is no right or wrong answer. So it's more so up to the subjectiveness of your interviewer to understand if you're doing well or not, which I couldn't really tell if I was doing well, but I thought I did okay enough to pass it. So for the third round, this was a very difficult question. I did have the full 45 minutes to try to solve it, but it was a 2 or 3 part question. Thankfully, once I conceptually walked through the problem, asked clarifying questions, he seemed pretty happy with my answer. I don't think it was perfect, but for a question that was that difficult, I think I had done well in terms of the conceptual walkthrough, as well as getting some sort of pseudocode out there. And I didn't use pseudocode, I actually coded using Java, but it wasn't perfect. The fourth round, when I had initially gotten that question, my heart sank a little bit because I thought it was a dynamic programming question. Thankfully, it didn't end up being a dynamic programming question, so that made me feel a little bit better. As I walked through asking this interviewer questions, it finally clicked in my head. And this is why I say definitely ask questions in your interview. I solved the problem. We actually ran it, so it was able to compile and run. I actually didn't get the correct answer, but I later found out why. It's because I had a small bug in my code, but he seemed to be really happy with my thought process and the fact that I was able to code something that quickly that actually compiled. But I ended up getting a call 2 hours later, and I got the offer. So I was really ecstatic. This was the company that I really wanted an offer from. It was my 10th interview at a big tech or FAANG company. So I was really excited because this was kind of my last shot at getting an interview, other than potentially having that LinkedIn interview in January. But for me, I was very ecstatic and I wanted this role. I actually forgot to film the end of this video, so if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and there will be more tech videos to come. Bye!